Yes, in continuation of my lecture, I have come up to section 131 of CPC. Today I'm going to start section 132, which deals with exemption of certain women from appearance in civil courts. And who are all that women are exempted from personal appearance in the court in pursuance of a case proceeded against them. They are women who are, according to their custom and also manners, they are not allowed to participate in any event in public. They are not even allowed to appear in public. There are certain women. Those women, according to their custom and also manners, not allowed to appear in public, are exempt from appearance. And nowadays, those kind of women are also now extinct. Majority of the women are now coming open in the out. Now, therefore, they can't claim any exemption. But even Muslim women, and especially Pardanashin women, were not allowed to appear in public. Now they are also now appearing in public. Therefore, they can now say that according to our custom, we cannot appear before the court because their custom is also now almost extinct. Therefore, they are also appearing in court. Therefore, even the very section 132 is now outdated. Though it was enacted before independence, when some of the women, according to their custom, were not able to come, the CPC provided some exemption in respect of those women who are not allowed to come in public. But that practice is now over. It is almost extinct and also it is outdated. But one more exemption is that you have come across one provision, that is section 57, wherein women are exempted from arrest, even arrest in execution of a decree for money. Therefore, in respect of those cases wherein a decree is passed for money, for recovery of money, and in pursuance of which any women, when women is to be proceeded against, such a women are all women, there is no distinction. All women against whom a money decree for recovery of money has been passed are exempt from arrest. But they have to resort to some other means for executing the decree. Therefore, they are exempted. And even then, if any woman claims any exemption, then they have to prove their case. They have to prove in the facts and circumstances case they are exempted from appearance in view of their appearance or prohibition of appearance in public. Now, this case, a case dealing with this topic has been dealt with in AR 1949, 2 MLJ 517, and also two more cases, 1950, 2 MLJ, page 385. You can refer to these two decisions for any clarity on this topic. And there are certain dignitaries also. They are exempted from appearance from court proceedings. That is dealt with in section 133, exemption of other persons. The following, kindly take down, if possible, the following persons shall be entitled to exemption from personal appearance in court, namely the President of India, the Vice President of India, the Speaker of the House of the People, Lok Sabha, the Ministers of the Union, the Judges of the Supreme Court, the Governors of States and the Administrators of Union Territories, the Speakers of the State Legislative Assembly, the Chairman of the State Legislative Council, the Ministers of State, the Judges of the High Courts, and the persons to whom 87B applies. They are all persons who are designated as rulers of former Indian states. Therefore, now this particular provision is also obsolete. That is out of date. Therefore, there is no former Indian rules now existing. Therefore, the question of exemption of their appearance will not come. This is also an extinct species. Therefore, in respect of others, they are not liable to appear before any court in pursuance of any legal proceedings initiated. But in this context, Section 133, you keep in mind that there are all constitutional dignitaries, and against whom no suit or no proceedings can even be initiated under the Constitution. But when you come across the provisions of the Constitution, you will know that certain dignitaries like President of India, Vice President, Speaker, Chairman of the upper house, all are exempted from even prosecution or even any civil process of a court. They are exempted. And ministers, I don't think they will have any exemption under the Constitution. They will be liable. They are bound to appear. But their personal appearance is now dispensed with by virtue of this section. But they have to answer any legal proceedings if initiated against them. They are not exempted from any proceedings. But this, according to the CPC, they are exempted from personal appearance in view of the position they occupy. Otherwise, they are liable, except those dignitaries in respect of whom constitutional protection is given. The legal proceedings can be initiated. And what is consequence that is protected is from appearing before a court of law. That alone is exempted under Section 133. Now, Section 134 deals with arrest other than in execution of etiquette. There are certain instances wherein even during the course of a litigation, a civil case, there may arise an occasion wherein the defendant cited may be liable for arrest for something or misconduct, disobedience, and also failure to comply with certain directions. In those instances, if in CPC there's a provision for arrest, then this arrest can also be effected against such of those persons. But certain persons are exempted from such a arrest in cases where the persons against whom such order has been passed happen to be the members of parliament, members of legislative assembly, legislative council of a state, legislative assembly of a union territory, and also during the continuance of any meeting also, the Lok Sabha or the parliament and also state assemblies will constitute various committees. For those committees, the MLAs and MPs will be nominated to head and also to occupy the places in the committee. Those members of the committee also are exempted from appearance. Entitled to exemption from appearance and also arrest also. They will be released for the period when the legislative session is in progress, when the session of the parliament is in progress. During those periods, when these sessions are in force or sessions are continuing, they are exempted from either arrest and also appearance from courts. And even the judges not exempted from arrest. The subordinate judges, no judge, magistrate, or judicial officer shall be liable to arrest under civil process while going to the court, while proceeding over the court, and also returning from the court to their residence. Therefore, during these time, proceeding from house to the court, proceeding there, and also from the court to their house, back to their house, this time they will not be subjected to any arrest. They are exempted from arrest. That is mentioned in Section 135. And also these in respect of members of parliament and also legislative council, legislative assembly of a state, during the course of the session of a committee also, they are exempted from appearance and also arrest, liable to arrest. But when they are released from arrest, once the session is over, then they have to, they will be rearrested and they have to complete the term for which they are arrested or detained in civil prison. Now, next section is section 136. Section 136 deals with arrest warrant issued by a court against a person who is residing in the jurisdiction of another court. Though we have touched on this topic earlier, on a slightly different aspect, this section with a specific situation wherein the court has to pass an order of arrest against a person who is residing within the jurisdiction of another court. And also a property has to be attached in the course of a suit or in the course of the proceedings of a suit. And also that property sought to be attached is lying in the jurisdiction of another court. It is not as if the court is powerless. According to section 136, the court can issue a warrant of arrest against a defendant who is residing in the jurisdiction of another court, and a property which is a subject matter of the suit pending in the other court is situated in the jurisdiction of the other court. The court can pass an order of attachment. But how it can be effected? This order of arrest, that is the warrant of arrest, will be sent to the district court of that place where that defendant is residing. And also the attachment order is also sent to the district court in the jurisdiction of which that particular property is situated. But here, the district court or the district judge, as and when he received this order, he has to execute it as if it is an order passed by him or her within its jurisdiction. Therefore, the district court, on receipt of a warrant of arrest, immediately he caused the arrest of that particular person through his own officers, through his own subordinate officers, and he can even send the district court also can send it to subordinate court for the assistance. And also the property can also be attached by the district court itself. But one particular condition is that a person who is arrested, and if that person is brought before that court which arrested that person, he can apply for exemption. Exemption means I will appear before that court which passed the order. If to that satisfaction of the district court, if that person arrested gives surety and also some personal bond for his appearance, and also an assurance, and also to the satisfaction of the court that he will discharge the amount that will be passed, that he will be held liable in a court of law, in the pursuance of that so he will discharge that liability. Then the court will release him on condition he should appear before the court which passed the order of arrest. Likewise, in respect of the property which is attached by the district court, that is the court which is requested, then what is the power of that court? Can it raise that attachment on the application made by the claimant? With regard to this order of attachment, the district court has no power at all. If the claimant wants to raise that attachment, he has to approach the court which issued that order. Therefore, he cannot file an application before the court which has caused that attachment or which has executed that order of attachment. He cannot move that court. He has to come to the court which issued that order. Only that court alone has a jurisdiction. But one case on this subject is reported in AR 1963, Mysore 147. This case deals with the situation where the subcourt Kurnool has attached a lorry which is located in the jurisdiction of the district court, Bellary. As soon as the subcourt Kurnool passed an order of attachment in respect of that lorry, That order was sent to the district court, Bellary. But in the district court, Bellary, the claimant of that lorry filed a petition for raising that attachment. The district court raised that attachment on its satisfaction, that it will be produced before the subcourt Kurnool. But against that order, somebody took it in appeal, or the opposite party took it in appeal. The Mysore High Court held that the court to which that request has been sent has no power to raise the attachment. The only court that has power to raise that attachment is the court which issued the order, and not the court to which that request has been sent. Therefore, the High Court set aside that order, raising the attachment over the lorry. Therefore, it is reported in AR 1963, Mysore, page 147. Then this is all with regard to section 136. And next section, it is an important section, kindly take a note. Section 144 deals with restitution of the properties, or restitution of the property or anything that has been lost as a result of execution of a decree or an order by the court. When that will be restituted or restored to the person who has lost it. Suppose, take for example, a decree has been passed, and in pursuance of that decree, and by virtue of execution of that decree, a property has changed hands to the decree holder. And against that order or a decree, the judgment debtor has filed an appeal. In the appeal, that decree is reversed. But in the meantime, in execution of that decree, the property has changed hands, or the subject matter of the case has been delivered over to the decree holder. Now it is reversed or modified by the appellate court. Then what is the remedy left to the judgment debtor? The judgment debtor can file an application under section 144 that the decree in respect of which this execution has been levied and the property has been now delivered to the decree holder has to be returned to me, because the decree under which that property has been taken away is now set aside or modified or varied. In those cases, the court has to pass an order restituting the person from whom that property has been taken away by virtue of the execution. That is the doctrine of restitution. And here, the court has, it's an equitable principle. Once, as a result of an erroneous order, it will be understood like this. As a result of an erroneous order, only because of this error, the appellate court interfered and set aside that order or varied that order. Therefore, it is an erroneous order passed by the lower court, which resulted in the loss of the subject matter from the hands of the judgment debtor. Therefore, nobody should suffer on account of the mistake committed by a court. Therefore, this is the principle. This is the underlying principle, section 144. No person put to any loss or an injury by reason of the wrong order passed by the court or erroneous order passed by the court. Therefore, the court must be very prompt enough to see that the property which has been taken away is restored or restituted in the hands of the person from whom it is taken away. That is the principle behind it. Here, one condition is you have to file the petition only in the court of first instance. You know what is the court of first instance? First instance court is nothing but the court which entertained the suit originally. Therefore, only wherever the decree goes and it has been set aside in the appellate stage, revisional stage, or even up to the Supreme Court. When that decree is reversed, then he has to come back. The judgment debtor has to come back to the court which passed the decree and apply for restitution. And then there may be instances wherein the decree will be not only set aside or varied by the appellate court or revisional court or even by the Supreme Court. And there may be instances wherein that decree may be set aside in another suit by another court. You visualize the situation. This decree not only can be set aside, taken up in appeal by the aggrieved party in the suit to the appellate court, but a situation may arise where even the decree holder or somebody else, or sorry, the judgment debtor or somebody claiming under it might file a suit in another court, wherein he asked for setting aside this decree saying that not binding, or under what circumstances that the decree came to be passed. Therefore, the decree is not binding or the decree is not enforceable. Therefore, it has to be set aside. Therefore, if a different court sets aside that decree, and by reason of which the original court, the court of first instance executed the decree, and also the decree holder has taken away the subject matter. As I told you, that you have to file application for restitution only in the very court which passed the decree, though it has been set aside by either the appellate court or another court. But you cannot file a petition for restitution by way of another suit. You have to kindly understand it, that no suit is permitted. No suit can be filed, permitted to be filed for restitution. For restitution, you have to come back to only the very court which passed the decree or rejected the decree. Therefore, the court of first instance alone can grant that decree, even if it is set aside by different courts. Therefore, for restitution of these the articles or the properties that has been taken away, it can be done only by the court of first instance. You have to take note of it. And also, even if the court of first instance is not in existence, it has been shifted to some other place, or it has been designated to some other court or peculiar jurisdiction, everything changed. But the court which could have entertained the suit, in respect of which that decree has been passed, if a suit has to be filed per person for the very same person, very same relief, which that court which has jurisdiction then will have to be tapped or will have to be approached. Therefore, even if that court is not there, by virtue of any shifting or by virtue of any by the enhancement of pecuniary jurisdiction, even in those cases, if which is the court that will be competent to entertain the suit, had it been filed, the suit that is filed can be filed in the court. Therefore, that court which has jurisdiction can be approached for restitution of these properties which has been lost. Now, a case law is reported in 1991 Supreme Court cases, SEC 513. And one more principle is, if any this restitution connotes a fair play on the part of the court. This principle has been expounded in a decision reported in AR 1953 Supreme Court 136, and also 2012 3 SEC 584, and also AR 1966 Supreme Court 948. These three cases are landmark cases which deal with this particular aspect of law. Therefore, kindly go through those decisions. Then section 148. This is also one of the important sections in CPC, enlargement of time. Whether the court can enlarge the time, it has been already fixed for doing something by a party. Therefore, if a party is required to do something on or before such a date, and if that party did not comply with that order, whether can they get enlargement of that time limit? That enlargement can be done by the power conferred on the civil code in section 148 of CPC, enlargement. But previously, there was a time when the court cannot enlarge the time. That was the understanding, because by virtue of interpretation by various courts in India, including the Honorable Supreme Court, that once an order has been passed fixing a date for compliance, and And there will be one more condition also, failing which the order passed already stand vacated, or there will be no order for extension. Therefore, any order likewise if passed, and also that order has not been complied with. And there is one more rider, and beyond which there will be no extension, but the order already passed will be vacated. In those cases, the court has repeatedly held previously that such orders or the time limit prescribed in that order cannot be extended. They will say, or the court will say, the order itself has worked itself out. When the order itself has worked itself out, then the court will become functus officio. Therefore, the court has no power at all to extend its own time limit already fixed. Therefore, the court will become functus officio. Court will become helpless. Therefore, there was a time the court interpreted such orders that way. But now, in view of section 148, now a wider interpretation has been, and also section 151, which provides for inherent power to the courts. Therefore, in these two sections, now particularly section 140, which specifically provides for enlargement of time, that itself says, I will read the section, when any period is fixed or granted by the court for doing of any act prescribed or allowed by this court, the court may, in its discretion, from time to time, enlarge such period, not exceeding 30 days. Then what I am going to read hereafter will make the difference, or will make the change of understanding of that law. Even though the period originally fixed or granted may have expired. Therefore, even in cases wherein the time limit already given is expired, we can file a petition for enlargement of time. Therefore, the court will come to the rest, provided you must give a proper reason for failure to comply with the order within that time limit. Therefore, in those cases wherein the aggrieved person is able to explain why he could not comply with that order, comply with the order within that time limit, then the court will always extend time. Here also one rider, but the extension cannot be more than 30 days. It can be extended only for 30 days only. Beyond that 30 days, it cannot be even so. But now, one more interpretation is now sought to be given by the courts, even in cases where these 30 days has expired. But there may be cases where even within these 30 days, one cannot comply with that order in extraordinary circumstances. If that extraordinary circumstance is proved to the satisfaction of the court, by reason of which he could not comply with that order, even within that extended period of 30 days, now one can move the court under section 151, which provides for inherent power. Therefore, section 151, which I will later, gives extraordinary power on the court, extraordinary power on the court to extend, extraordinary power to the court to extend or to enlarge the time limit from the time it has already expired. Therefore, this works itself out, and also functus officio, these expressions have no place in our present jurisprudence. The court has power, almost power, which can be exercised in circumstances which will warrant the interference or the assistance of the court. And now, this inherent power, you have to read section 148 along with section 141. This principle of law is explained elaborately in a decision reported in 2008 6 CTC page 559, and also 2008 4 CTC 499, 2008 1 CTC 47. Therefore, the rigor of that time limit is now diluted by reason of the power, special power given under section 148, and also the inherent power that is found in section 151. And next section is section 148A. This is also an important section in CPC. 148A deals with caveat. What is a caveat? Caveat is a warning. Warning given by a person. In case you move an application in a suit against me, you kindly give me notice. This is the crux of the that principle caveat. Caveat, one has to be alert. That means one has to give notice about the application being filed. Therefore, if any person apprehends that an application will be moved against him in a suit and an order against him will be obtained in his absence in a court of law, he can straight away file a caveat under section 148A of CPC. Once that caveat is filed, then any person, that expected person or the expected plaintiff, you can say, files a suit along with an application for an interim order. He has to serve the notice on the person who has lodged a caveat with the court. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the court to see that such caveat is served with a notice before that application is moved. That's the crux. Therefore, I will read it. Where an application is expected to be made or has been made in a suit or proceeding instituted or about to be instituted in court, any person claiming a right to appear before the court on the hearing of such application may lodge a caveat in respect thereof. Where a caveat has been lodged, the caveator shall serve a copy of notice by registered post with acknowledgement on the person by whom the application is expected to be made. Therefore, before you move an application along with the suit what is the procedure for filing a caveat application? The caveat application has to be filed in a court where this the person expects a suit will be filed along with an application. He has to file it after sending a registered notice to the person from whom such a suit is expected to be filed. Therefore, you have to send notice, a registered notice with acknowledgement, and that notice has to be sent to the person, a probable person who is going to file the suit along with the application. And then along with the receipt for the registration of that notice, postal registration slip receipt, it has to be filed in the court. And this caveat application will be numbered. And as and when that expected person files the suit along with an application, the court will require him to serve notice saying that already a caveat has been filed against you. Therefore, you serve all the notice and papers to that caveator. Only after service of that notice, and connected papers, will that application be numbered. And when that is numbered, the court will issue one more notice. This notice to the caveator, calling upon him to explain why this interim order cannot be given. Therefore, he has to be given a notice, proper notice by the court, because these are all responsibility of the court. And this caveat will remain in force for 6 months. After the expiry of 6 months, the validity will expire. Therefore, one has to renew that application before the expiry of 6 months for continuity of the caveat. For continuity of the caveat, it has to be lodged once over again before the expiry of 6 months. And it can be filed even after the expiry also. But the caveat will lose its validity within 6 months. And what is the consequence of an order passed by a court ignoring the registration of a caveat? Suppose if any party moves the court without serving notice on the caveat, or without informing the court that a caveat is already filed, then automatically, once it is brought to the notice of the court, the order passed, interim order passed will be vacated. But what will be the consequence of that application? That application is not invalid, will not be invalidated. That application will be kept pending, but the court will hear that application after notice to that caveat, and after hearing the caveat only, the court will pass order on merit. Therefore, the order passed earlier will not be invalid, but it will be vacated. But the court will hear the application on merit. After hearing both the sides, the court will pass an order. Therefore, the court is not tied. The hands of the court is not tied in hearing the application. The order passed already without notice to the caveat, though it is set aside, or though it is vacated, you can rehear the case and pass order on merit. This is reported in 2008 5 CTC, page 319. And who is the person on whom the caveat can serve notice? We have said initially, when I started this aspect, under section 148A, the person expected to file a suit along with an application. But if the person expected to file an application along with the suit is not known, and also the person who is going to file the suit in respect of a matter which the person is having in mind, not known at that time, then what is the remedy open to you? But if that suit is filed by any member of the public or by any person whom he may not know, therefore in those cases he can file a petition saying that under what circumstances he could not identify the person who is going to file the suit. A petition can be filed under section 151 to dispense with the service of notice on a particular person. That means a registered notice cannot be sent to that person because that person cannot be identified then. Therefore, one has to approach the court by way of an application along with the suit and also application. Along with an application saying that the person who is expected to move the application in the suit is now not known. We are not able to identify. Kindly dispense with the service of notice on that person and permit the person to file the caveat without mentioning the name of the proposed plaintiff or the expected plaintiff and also the petitioner. In those cases, if the request is genuine, the court will dispense with service of notice by the caveat on the proposed person who is not identifiable then. But then, therefore, the application under section 151 has to be filed. The court in all cases, if it is filed, will allow that petition and permit the caveat to file the caveat in the court. The relevant case law on this topic, 2009 6 CTC, page 774. And next important section is 149. Section 149 deals with the power of court to permit a person who has not paid the proper court fee at the time when a case is filed. But what that particular provision reads is it may look confusing, but I will read that section because it will be confusing now. But I will explain to you in the light of the decision rendered by the Honorable Supreme Court. But the wordings in that section is a little bit confusing. I will read it only for your understanding. Where the whole or any part of any fee prescribed for any document. The word used in section 149 is only documents. It doesn't say any proceedings, any court fee payable for a proceedings or for a suit. Therefore, you have to take into account The word that is used in section 140 is document only. I will read it once more. Where the whole or any part of any fee prescribed for any document by the law for the time being in force relating to court fee has not been paid, the court may, in its discretion, at any stage, allow the person to pay the deficit court fee, and upon payment, the document, once over again that word document, that document in respect of which such a fee is payable shall have the same force and effect as if paid in the first instance. Therefore, if any person files a suit in haste, because the time limit for filing a suit under the Limitation Act is now fast approaching. In those cases, suppose a huge court fee has to be paid in respect of a case, then he will be helpless. He will rush to the court, approach a lawyer, and file a suit. You take it as a suit. They file a suit without paying the court fee or part of the court fee prescribed for such a suit. Then definitely the case will not be entertained because of the deficit of court fee. But he can always apply to the court under section 140, seeking permission to pay that additional court fee, the deficit court fee. That deficit court fee can be filed, or deficit court fee can be paid, provided the court grants permission. But you have to state the reason why you could not pay the full court fee at the time when the case was filed. If the court takes a lenient view, and also if the court is satisfied about the reasoning given by the plaintiff or the person who approached the court, that the court fee could not be paid either in whole or in part at the time when the case was filed, the court will always permit the person to pay the deficit court fee. But once that deficit court fee is paid, then it will be the very case will be treated as if it was filed with the full court fee at the time when the case was filed at the first instance. Then when it was filed, when it was filed, the court fee was not fully paid. But once it is paid with the permission of the court later, it will be treated as if the court fee has been paid at the very first instance itself when the suit was originally filed. Now, I have to explain that the document used in section 149, the document is now interpreted to mean only the suit, a civil case. The document, you should not get confused, but why that word has been used, we don't know. But the court has now interpreted very, very favorably, saying that the document is nothing but the suit only, because civil procedure code deals with the procedure relating to the suits, relating to civil suit. Therefore, the court held document is nothing but a suit only. Therefore, in respect of suits, any deficient court fees paid, the court will always entertain an application for permission to pay the deficient fee, provided sufficient reason is given for failure to pay the full court fee at the time when it was filed. Now, the relevant case law on this topic is 2003 2 MLJ, page 305, which says the document includes, there may be other documents also. The court did not restrict the power of the civil court, but it enlarges the definition of that document to give suit also. But it doesn't say the document that is mentioned in section 149 is the suit only. No. Document includes suit also. Therefore, any other proceedings may also be included in the definition of document. Therefore, I kindly go through the case reported in 2003 2 MLJ 305 and also AR 1971, Supreme Court, page 1374, and also 2012 4 CTC 06. Then a question will arise. Suppose a suit is filed within time. There is no problem about the limitation. You know that for filing a civil suit, three-year period is normally given under the Limitation Act. 3 year period is given. Suppose a person files a suit about after the expiry of 2.5 years. Then half years or 6 months is now left for filing the suit. But he files the suit after the expiry of 2 years and 6 months. In such cases, there are time left, more than 6 months now left. And in that circumstances, if the court fee is paid lesser than the required court fee, then he can always file an application for permission to pay the remaining court fee. But there is no question of limitation. It can be filed even within 6 months thereafter also. In those circumstances, the court will number the case once that deficient court fee is paid, because it will not affect the other side. The defendant has no right whatsoever when the court fee is not paid, fully paid, within the time limit prescribed under the Limitation Act. Therefore, the question of limitation will not arise. Therefore, in cases where there is ample time for expiry of the period prescribed for filing a suit, and the court fee is not paid fully, and the time given is also, the time given by the court is also comes within that the 3-year period, or the rest of the time limit which is still left for filing a suit, then the defendant will not get any notice. He is not entitled to a notice. But only when the court fee is not paid. Suppose if the court says, yes, you file you pay the court fee within 1 month. 1 month means after 2 years, 6 months, it was filed, and 1 month more given for paying the deficient court fee. That will take the 2 year and the 7th month only. Therefore, it is far short of the three-year period fixed for limitation. In those cases also, if the court fee is paid within that time limit, no notice is necessary to the defendant. But in cases where time is given for payment and within time limit, but court fee was paid beyond the period of 3 years, and in those cases, if the deficient court fee is paid after the expiry of 3 years, then the defendant has to be given notice. Therefore, he gets a right. He can question that payment of deficient court fee. Therefore, he has to be given a notice in cases where the deficient court fee is paid beyond the period of limitation prescribed under the Limitation Act. Therefore, you have to take into account these particular aspects. Within time, deficient court fee paid, defendant is not entitled to notice. If deficient court fee is paid with the permission of the court beyond the time given, and that also goes beyond the period of actual period of limitation, then the defendant has to be served with a note, and the defendant has to be heard. Therefore, there the notice is necessary. And one more important section in CPC, section 151, that speaks of inherent powers of the civil court. Inherent power. Inherent power, you know, the power which inheres in the court to meet contingencies. That means to prevent misuse of court or abuse of process of court, and also advance the courts of justice. It is in the interest of justice. It can always exercise the power which is already there. But this power is vast enough to meet the ends of justice and also prevent abuse of power. And also it is designed to do justice and also to undo any wrong in both the cases, because the power conferred under section 151 is very, very vast than all the provisions which confer power in the CPC. Take for example any provision which confers power under civil court, but that power has been given in certain circumstances, but that powers are hemmed in by various safeguards. But here under section 151, there is no safeguard given. Court is given a carte blanche, a blank check, what we call in ordinary parlance. The court has been given ample power without any check. In those instances, then court has to be responsible. Court cannot travel beyond certain limits, but it is a self-imposed limits. Therefore, it is the wisdom of the court. And also it is the discretion of the court that has to be exercised. The wisdom of the court and also the discretion of the court, by discretion of the court, has to be exercised by common sense. And also by the principles we have come across. It should not be unfair to the other party. Therefore, the power that is vast, the self-restraint that is required is also vast. The court has to exercise self-restraint. Merely because there is no safeguard, there is no guidelines. Though in all those other sections, there are safeguards. Therefore, the court will always supervise, and also the court will have a guidance to follow. But in section 151, the vast power has been given without any guidelines, without any safeguard. The entire matter is given to the discretion of the court, to the wisdom of the court. Therefore, it has to be exercised very cautiously. Therefore, inherent power does not take a new power. The court recognizes the power which is already in the court. That is only for meeting the ends of justice and also for preventing the abuse of court. In those two circumstances, the court order. But it can pass any order or it can grant any relief that is provided under the Act. But if in respect of cases where, of course, relief is provided under the Act, but that power cannot be exercised because the provision which grants such power, or the provision which gives such power, which can be resorted to for getting that relief, may be constricted. In those cases, the section 151 will come into play. Therefore, in cases where relief could not be granted because of the constriction or because of the various safeguards that's given under the various provisions of CPC, and in a particular case where the ends of justice demands, then the court will always come forward to grant relief that are necessary for meeting the ends of justice and also for preventing abuse of process of court. Therefore, there is elaborately these principles to discuss in AR 2008 Supreme Court, page 1909. Then one more case reported is 2008 for CC 791. And under this section, in exercise of this inherent power, I have said you that it does not create a new power. It is only a substantive procedure which enables, by which it enables the court to exercise the jurisdiction which is already there in the court itself. But in other provisions, court is given power by the legislation. Here the legislation, even the legislature, recognize the power which is already there. To what is for all this court for? Court is for rendering justice. Therefore, in cases where justice demands or ends of justice demands, and also there may be circumstances where to prevent the abuse of process of court, the court has to step in. In those cases, the court will not feel helpless. Therefore, the inherent power is permitted to be exercised by the civil court, though other provisions also may provide relief. But where, because of the constriction, because of the safeguards that is provided, the court cannot render justice. In those circumstances, 151 can be resorted to. Now, I have given the case law. One more case law is even consolidation of suits. There are 2 or 3 suits pending. In those cases, all similar matters, similar issues are involved. In those cases, the court will always power to consolidate those suits and order a joint trial by exercising its power under section 151. By this section, the court will always consolidate 2 suits or 3 suits together if all the issues involved are one and the same. This is reported in 2004, 3 SCC, page 85. And the other cases dealing with this aspect is 2011, 3 CTC, 422. The equivalent is 2011, volume 11, SCC 275. And I have already told you that it is not a substantive provision which confers a power, not a substantive provision. But other provisions, like take for example, interim injunction, Article 39 to 1 and 2. These are all substantive provisions which confers power to grant an order of interim injunction in those provisions. These are all substantive provisions which confers power. But section 151 takes, you keep it in mind, does not confer any substantive power. It is only a procedure. Procedure means when that power which is already there, even without conferment of that power by a legislation, is already there. You exercise that power. Therefore, that it's not a substantial power that is conferred by the statute. It's a power that is inherent in the court. So that is explained in 2004-3 SCC and also 2011-3 CTC. I have already given the citation. And as I already told you or said, that the court is permitted to do what is right. And it is also permitted to undo what is wrong. You have to take note of it. The courts are permitted in exercise of power under section 151, that is inherent power, to do what is right and also to undo what is wrong. This is the principle that is expounded in those case laws while explaining the scope of the power that is given under section 151, or that is mentioned in section. The given is a different meaning. That is mentioned in section 151 is the inherent power. What for that power is given is explained in those cases which I have given you. And in these cases where the courts are expected to exercise its power under section 151, the court will have to be doubly cautious because there is no legislative guidance or there is no safeguard. Therefore, everything depends upon, in those circumstances, the discretion and wisdom of the court. The power has to be exercised with care and circumspection when there is no provision in the code. Then in one case, the court interferes under section 151 also to set aside an ex parte order. To set an ex parte decree or order, one has to file an application under order 9 Rule 30. This is the normal procedure. But in cases where fraud is committed and an ex parte order has been obtained, then the court can exercise jurisdiction under section 151 also to do justice. Or in order to meet the ends of justice, it need not file or it need not expect an application, a regular application under order 9 Rule 30 to set aside an ex parte order. But in case where the court finds that there is a fraud committed upon court and ex parte decree or order obtained, then the court will always exercise its power under section 151. That is reported in 2013 3 CTC 356 Supreme Court. And sometimes there may be some inadvertent error in the decreed order. These can be corrected also. Some mistakes in the order can be corrected also by exercising its power under section 151. Then section 152. 152 is amendment of judgment, decrees or orders. You have to read section 151 and 152 together. 152 also is an allied provision which relates to the inherent power of the court, or the inherent power of the court is extended a little bit under section 152. Here, amendment of the judgment, decrees or orders. But this power is very much restricted. Clerical error, arithmetical mistakes in judgments, decrees or orders, errors, and also some omission that can be corrected under section 152. But court will not allow a review of that judgment. If the court inadvertently made some mistakes, and anybody can understand what the court felt or what the court intended, then to that extent, such omission or such a mistake can be corrected. But if it requires an argument, and also the intention is also the court consciously passed that order, even it is a mistaken order, then it cannot be corrected under section 152. Therefore, unintentional error, inadvertent error can alone be corrected. But if it is a mistake which has been committed consciously by the judge who wrote that judgment, it cannot be corrected under section 152. Otherwise, it will be a review. Review means that there are other provisions to deal with review. But for correction, exercise of inherent jurisdiction is very limited to the extent of correcting a mistake in the decree or order, mistake or unintentional omission, inadvertent error that can be corrected. Then there is one more provision, section 153. This is also a power which can be exercised by the court. Suppose a proper relief has been asked and plea has also been drafted in the main body of the suit, but the plea could not sustain framing of a proper issue. A proper question cannot be taken. A proper question cannot be raised in order to give the relief. Relief has been asked for with all clarity. But while reading the plaint, that cannot support the relief that is claimed, not because he has no merit in the case, but because of the use of language. Now the court is not able to raise a proper issue or a proper question so as to render relief to the party. In those cases, the court will correct the plea in order that the court can raise a proper issue or a question. Therefore, you have to minutely understand what is the power that is given. Relief asked for is clear. And also what the plaintiff has also intended to obtain from the court, correct. But the plea, the statement made in the plaint could not sustain a proper question that can be raised. But it does not touch on the merit of the case or merit of the title or anything that is asked for, that is mentioned in the suit. Therefore, in those cases, the court will permit a person to amend the pleadings. The amendment of the plaint, that's all different. But here it is only enable the party to correct it so as to raise proper issue and proper question. Therefore, it is section 153. Then we will take the next lesson from order 1, rule 11 in the next class. But I am concluding the lecture today.